Добрий день, я вітаю.
Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform continues its operation today. My name is Olga Atamanova and it's day 289 of the full-scale offensive of the Russian aggressor and the heroic resistance of the Ukrainian people. And now we will be talking about the energy systems of Ukraine. Our speaker today is Volodymyr Kudrytskyi, the chairman of the board of Ukrenerho. Good afternoon, Mr. Volodymyr. We know that this week Russians unfortunately inflicted another missile strike on the power grid. Thanks to our armed forces, a number of missiles were repelled, but there are still consequences. So what are they? How are we rebuilding our power grid? Good afternoon. Yes, on Monday there was another strike by the enemy, a massive strike of 70 heavy missiles on our power grid. After that strike, there was damage on both facilities operated by Ukrenerho, the substations, the power transportation substations, specifically in the south of our country, which resulted in lengthy power shutdowns in Odessa region, and both power generating stations. And some of the stations which received damage were forced to stop generation of electric power, and now gradually we are trying to restore the generation at the thermal power plants and to bring it back to the indicators before the last attack. Generally, the power grid is operating in normal operation mode. After the last attack, quite steadily and rapidly, it was not unbalanced. It operates as the integral system of Ukraine, which is connected to, together with our neighbors in Moldova, it's connected to the European power grid, which is an important factor which contributes to the stability of our power grid operation. This time I would like to emphasize that there was an outstanding job done by our air defense forces. They were able to down a larger number of missiles than previously, and it was an important factor which contributed to the fact that the last attack did not result in as heavy damage as those previous ones. And obviously, without our air defense forces, without their contribution in protection of the critical infrastructure, the power technicians would not have been able to cope with these massive strikes. I will remind you that more than 1,000 heavy missiles and drones were launched at the power infrastructure facilities of Ukraine, starting from the 10th of October, but their first attempt was even back in September. So we lived through 8 large waves and more than 10 smaller scale strikes. And first of all, we went through that thanks to our armed forces. We endured it. Unfortunately, in some regions where the facilities were damaged, the restoration works are in process. The works are going on 24/7. So I'm talking about the power plants and substations operated by both government-controlled and private companies. Wherever it's possible, we restore the generating capacities and the transportation capacities to deliver the power to large cities such as Kyiv, Odessa, Lviv, Kharkiv, Dnipro, and others. If I may, what are the regions where the situation is most complicated with the restoration works, and when we can count on switching back to scheduled power shutdowns rather than emergency shutdowns? Well, as to the difficulty of the situation, is Kherson and Odessa regions. Well, Kherson region, due to reasons we all understand, the power grid was almost destroyed to the ground there, and it's being rebuilt almost from scratch, I would say, brick by brick. The level of mining there is beyond any imagination. However, our power technicians, they've seen a lot in the occupied territories, but now they're facing another level of challenge. And the works are complicated in Donetsk and Kharkiv region, I mean in terms of restoration of the network. In other region, the work is in progress too, I mean Kiev and Lviv region, but apparently the situation is most difficult in the south and Kharkiv region. So as to the rolling power shutdowns, the scheduled shutdowns, when are we going to be able to switch to the scheduled power shutdowns? Well, I would like to show you this image. I don't know if you're seeing it right here. Check it out what we're dealing with. I cannot disclose the figures of the deficit, but this is the graph of consumption and deficit we're seeing within one day. This is what it looks like. So let's take an average working day, average weekday of December. In red, we're seeing the deficit we're experiencing on 24 hours basis, and the shutdowns are going on 24/7. How it happens? For example, if today we're seeing the forecasted deficit every single hour for the next day, it changes on an hourly basis, and there are peaks of consumption in the morning and in the evening, and the consumption is lower in the night. So that's why we determine the deficit for every hour of the next day, and we distribute this deficit proportionally across all the regions as the operator of the power grid. Then Ukrenerho, together with the military administrations, they draw up a graph of restrictions, of limitations. For example, like after the rocket attack or systematic emergency, it happens that the limits allocated for the regions, they just cannot fall within those limits, and the operator is forced to implement the additional emergency shutdown schedules, because the system has to be balanced, and if it's not balanced, it will just it may collapse. So it's our duty as the operator to maintain the overall balance, to deliver the limits to the regions, and if there is a huge deficit in the region that the region cannot comply with, so we implement the emergency shutdown schedules when we see that the consumption grows above the generation. So the most important factor when we will be able to switch to scheduled power shutdowns is when the deficit will be reduced to the figures when Ukrenerho, the regional branches, will be able in a scheduled mode to switch off different queues of consumers every 4 hours, and then those schedules may be strictly complied with. This is why the issue of deficit reduction is mostly related to restoration of generation capacities. I'm talking about the thermal power plants, nuclear power plants, hydraulic power plants. The nuclear power plants now maintain the system, they are in operation, but I want everybody to understand that nuclear generation covered half of the needs of the power, and it does now, so we cannot make it with only nuclear power generation. We cannot fully cover the needs of our consumers And that's why we need other types of generation which are severely damaged. There is no single thermal power plant in Ukraine that wouldn't have been damaged by those attacks. And almost all of the hydraulic power plants endured certain damages. And their generating capacity is now limited comparing to normal times, to normal modes, the period before the invasion. And to summarize it all, we're seeing that the temperature is warm, so we restore the operation of the electric power plants, and the amount of generation increases, thus decreasing the deficit. I think that within a couple of days we will achieve that limit when we will be able to comply with those scheduled power shutdowns across the regions implemented by Ukrenerho. Thank you, sir. Your dear colleagues, your questions, please. Good afternoon, Yana Koloda, Ukrinform. I have the following question to you. Does Ukraine have any agreements about the supply of electric power from abroad? Well, within technical capabilities of import, yes, there are opportunities, there are agreements back from that moment of synchronization with European power grid in March this year. There was no need in the middle of the year. We exported the electric power in the middle of the year. Yeah, there is technical opportunity, but the problem is that the European electric power is more expensive than European, so there is no player in the Ukrainian market who would have been able to buy 1 kilowatt hour at 250 euro and sell it in Ukraine for 70 euro. Within Ukraine, Ukrenerho is not authorized to procure any electric power. We only provide the transportation and the operation of the grid. So there is a special financing mechanism required, which is being formed now. This mechanism is being searched for, so we could additionally soften this deficit with the help of import of electric power. And I would like to mention, to say a couple of words about export. Yeah, because I've seen a lot of fakes on the internet that as if Ukraine exports electric power to Hungary, and this is what results in deficit. And I want to put a period in this discussion. So Ukraine exports no electric power since 11th of October. The export is restricted and it cannot be happening. We do not distribute the access to the interstate power lines. This is number one thing. Some people, some civil actors appeal to the side of INSUI, where they see the technical flows of electric power and they confuse it with technical expert without understanding the substance or the essence of operation of the joint power grid. I just want to show you what I'm talking about. Electric power does not know about the borders between the states. When the grid is connected as Ukrainian, Moldovan, Romanian, Hungarian and Slovakian, there are technical flows, the physical flows, they are really small. If we consume as the country 15-16 megawatts, those physical flows may be 10 megawatt one way or 15 megawatt the other way, but the balance, the hourly balance is close to zero. So as much flows abroad, the same amount returns to Ukraine. When there are circular flows, these figures may be a little bit bigger. Like, for example, in Romania, they have a very well developed alternative sources of generation, and the lines which connect these two countries are weak, and the power from the standpoint of physics has to go through the territory of Moldova and Hungary and Ukraine and then come back to Romania in order to get from south to north, or the other way around. So this is the way the electric power travels around the grid, the joint grid. So in this situation, the amount of electric power going from Ukraine to Moldova is going back to Romania directly. So this is why Ukraine does not give anything to its neighbors, and there is no smaller amount of energy in Ukrainian power grid. So all the electric power generated by Ukrainian power plants stays here in Ukraine. And it's important to emphasize, because due to the limitation of power consumption, there is a lot of dissatisfaction in the civil society. And when those fakes are being pushed, we think that it's a Russian psychological operations, because if the power technicians say about that, it's something that can be confirmed by this website of NCE. The balance is zero, not 1 megawatt, not 5, but strictly zero. So now we're only talking about the options of import to soften the deficit, and I would like to call the Ukrainian so-called leaders of opinions not to share the Russian fakes, and I want to call our population to consume only high quality information, and desirably some official information, because those narratives, they are called to divert the attention from one single fact. We have restriction of power consumption all over Ukraine, not because somebody exports the electric power to Romania or Moldova or Hungary, or somebody repairs the lines in a slow manner, but because on a weekly basis we endure missile attacks on Ukrainian power grid. Thank you, and I have one more question to you. Recently, Ukrenerho stated about the difficult situation in the east due to the infrastructural facilities, and were we able to rebuild those facilities at least partially? Yeah, we were able to restore them in part, but we all have to understand that when we're talking about the shelling of a substation or a power plant, those are high-scale destructions, which would, under normal circumstances, it would take months to rebuild them. Now it only takes weeks, which means that to restore the functionality of the object for 100%, it's unrealistic to do it within a couple of days after shelling. And now we're talking on Friday after the Monday. But we're all still suffering the consequences of Monday's missile strike and previous ones due to the increase of the deficit. Now that we have less hours with light in the families at homes. More questions, please?
I'm working for the Swedish and Finnish public radio. My name is Lennart Bergen. Just a basic, what are the percentages of electric production in Ukraine from nuclear, thermal and hydroelectric? And then in Sweden we have a price of like up to 20 hryvnias per kilowatt hours. What is the price private people here pay for electricity, and is there any subventions? How big are the subventions, and is there another price for large scale like companies demanding much electricity? Do they get a lower price? Thanks.
Дякую. В Україні
In Ukraine, no matter how surprising the structure of energy consumption did not change a lot. As I mentioned, there is a lot of damage of the hydraulic power plants and thermal power plants, and some of them are in the occupied territories, but we also lost the power from Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and our capacities, they shrinked proportionally, so we get about a half of generation from nuclear power generation, and the rest of it comes from hydraulic and thermal power plants and alternative sources. As to the prices, the price for everybody is regulated. It's 1 hryvnia 68 kopecks with VAT, all about 101 kilowatt. There is a special mechanism for compensation of the difference by Ukrenerho between the market price and the tariffs for homes. And as for the businesses, the wholesale price is 3.4 hryvnias per kilowatt hour. This is the wholesale price without transportation through the networks, including distribution networks. So it's like ex-works price. It's lower than European. The 20 hryvnias you've mentioned is the final price for the homes in Sweden. But even the wholesale prices of the European markets are lower, and they are like 8, 10, 12 hryvnias per kilowatt hour, comparing to Ukrainian 3.3, 3.4 hryvnias. That's why import of electric power, which is technically available, but it will only be possible after the funding of procurement of this electric power by the special mechanism. Igor Moskalevich, the mirror of the week, the National Bank already forecast the scale of consumption. Did they talk to you? Yes, they do it regularly, but I don't have any concrete information in that regard. So I think that yes. Can you please detailize what's the question? Do we forecast any growth of consumption? No. Yesterday they made a statement that within the first quarter the deficit will be 25-29%, and the second quarter will be 7 to 10%. Is it growth or it's deficit on the system? Well, deficit on the system. Talking about today's situation, we understand that the deficit, based on the today's level of generation, will exist during the winter, autumn and winter period. It can be compensated in part by some measures like import, but not completely. This is why, let's say, we will have to work, us as the whole sector will have to work on increasing generation to create some exceed of generation, but we're not talking about that just yet. As to the generation, for what I understand, is the main challenge that we're facing now that we will have to solve. Obviously, we will need, there are resources required for that, such as equipment, material which was promised to be supplied by our international partners. Yes, they promised, and they are already delivering on their promises. We get certain types of equipment which are easier to find somewhere in European countries, in United States and other countries. We appreciate a lot the support of many countries which supply this equipment to Ukraine, so we could rebuild the power plants and distribution networks and mainway networks. So this process should be going on, so we are able to keep rebuilding our generation capacities, and this is the conveyor which should not stop, and this is very good because this support is very important. Some types of equipment are more complicated in terms of manufacturing, and no one was keeping them under normal conditions. But I think that Ukrainian Russian war and the fact that the Russians attack so cruelly and so infatuatedly the power infrastructure, the lessons learned from our war will be learned not only by us but all of our allies and partners as well, because we were ready to these attacks and we were preparing to them. But the fact that electrotechnical equipment is in high deficit all over the world now tells us that everybody should be prepared. Dear friends, do you have any more questions? Please go ahead. I see a question from consumers under our live. The people say that the power generating capacities were located in the occupied territories, so we have generation from 4 nuclear power plants, and why don't they cover even 2/3 of the needs of the population? Where did the generation go? There is no generation from 4 nuclear power plants, there is generation from 3 nuclear power plants. I mentioned already that Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is capable of generating 6,000 megawatts, is currently unavailable to us. It's in the temporarily occupied territories of our country, and we hope that very temporarily occupied. So you can make it minus 40% from nuclear power generation, and not all the high consumption industry is located in the eastern regions, and we have industry facilities which generated export revenue of our country. I mean Zaporizhzhia and Dnipro energetic node, they are not occupied, they consume electric power, but I want to mention that currently the share of consumption of the population grew comparing to the pre-war times, because the industry, the businesses, they lowered the consumption of electric power, and for others the regime of consumption does not allow to cover basic technological needs. The scale of generation fell comparing to the pre-war times. I understand this question. I want all our spectators and all Ukrainian consumers to understand that due to occupation of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, due to the attacks, there is damage on the generation capacities, and the percentage of it is lower than the percentage of shrinking of consumption. If we specifically see the level of consumption in the winter. Thank you for the responses. Thank you for this important information. Joining us was Volodymyr Kudrytskyi, chairman of the board of Ukrenerho. I will remind you, our next briefing is at 14:30, so bear with us. Trust in our armed forces, and let's work on our victory. Glory to Ukraine.